Bridget. You certainly, like me, you were an MVPD distribution person. We remember the days when there were 100 million subscribers. Let's talk about the effect that OTT is having on cord cutting. Bridget, do you mind jumping in?
I would, to me, and maybe I'm a little bit immersed in this because in particular, these last 10 days, I've been tearing through this book by an NYU professor and sociologist called The Anxious Generation. His name is Jonathan Haidt, and I happen to be the mother of 3 Gen Zs qualified by this birth, anyone born after 1995 or 1996. So I have so much of my view about cord cutting is tied into generational adaptation. Just all things being equal, if the audience had stayed the same, I don't know that, cord cutting would necessarily have been so rapidly adapted. And I mean that a little bit back to what Evan and Doug are saying about the technology parts of it. But what was happening is we were having this Gen Z or this, youngest generation growing up with portable kind of internet portals in their pockets. It's a lot of P's, but what that meant is they came of age at a time when there was zero tolerance for any advertising interruptions, a huge acceptance of user-generated content, and very little interest in kind of how we were all raised with dominant broadcast prime time programming, which all had a scheduled calendar mentality in our brains. If we knew a certain show Thursday night, NBC is the best example of this, prime time, must see TV. Back in the 90s, we were saying with Friends and ER, and then of course the Law and Order franchise, all of that was broadcast scheduled viewing. If the audience had not changed so dramatically, cord cutting might not be quite what it is today. But we had this giant generational shift, in large part due to the development of the iPhone and portable devices. And that has very much driven the concept of, what is this old lunky screen here in my, I don't even know what that is, and why would I ever turn it on? It's saturated with interruptions, and I never know, I'm not getting access to the things I want to see right now. So it was also the on-demand mentality of, I want to go and see it uninterrupted when I want to see it. And I think the acceleration, the adaptation of that is what accelerated cord cutting. So for giant, vertically integrated public entities like Comcast Corporation, there was no choice but to quickly shift from the broadcast mentality to where the viewers were going and the younger generations. And that was all on portable devices. So you have the evolution of things like, Evan was actually one of the first, CISO, which he mentioned, it was one of the first attempts, I think, outside of our Hulu creation and that period, where it was an attempt to take a vertical of just comedy content and put it out there in a, protected, specific type of content. But now you have Peacock TV and you have Paramount Plus, and you have all of these that are coming out of the big broadcast companies that are there for that viewer who just says, why do I need this other whole ecosystem? It doesn't serve me anymore.
Yeah, thank you, Bridget. Evan, why don't we toss to you?
Yeah, so just a couple of things. I think some of the generational shift. So I agree with everything Bridget said, absolutely, especially about the the access and the mobility, the decoupling or unbundling, as Doug called it, of the video economy was what accelerated the cord cutting. But there's just a couple of misnomers. I think, if you're under 30, you never cut the cord, you never had the cord. Maybe you did in your parents' house, but when you moved out, you went right to a cordless experience, which is also a misnomer because you have broadband. So that's thing number one. Thing number two, the unbundling of the ecosystem, the video bundle in cable, the pay TV bundle, hasn't been profitable for a very long period of time for the providers, not the publishers. The guaranteed carriage and the bundling of platforms for Disney and Warner Disco Brothers, which is what I call Warner Brothers Discovery, and Paramount and Fox and all the rest of the publisher aggregators, was enormously profitable because they kept charging. ESPN kept charging more and more and more for fees and rights every year. But in its heyday of the golden era of television and the height of pay TV, the cable companies and the MVPDs were not making their fortunes off of television. It was a break-even product. They were making it off of the accidental products they discovered while they build the pipes out for cable television and HD TV, which is broadband and telephone. And that triple play of telephone, broadband, and video created a protected shell around the Hollywood product, which again was only a break-even proposition. It was a loss leader to a certain extent to get people marketed into this larger play where the profit was in phone and broadband. As phone became something no one has, and as the video bundle became less rational because it was charging so much for channels that I was not using, ESPN being a great example of that, the idea that I would subscribe to a bundle of television shows for economies of scale makes apps, when you remove it from your broadband and your telephone, it becomes so inefficient and expensive that there's no reason to do it. So then suddenly Netflix, which was, basically free when it launched, but even now you can get a 3 or 4 services and still pay less than you would on pay TV. When you add YouTube TV to that, and that's a good question, like, is that cord cutting? Because that's really a cable package, but it's delivered via the internet. Then suddenly you're getting back to the price again, but you're still choosing everything you're paying for as opposed to paying for thousands of things you'll never watch. So I do think that's a nuance that's one of the reasons why traditional television is in such pain right now. Then you look at Amazon Prime, which is basically the new version of the triple play. You get home free delivery, you get, all these other products. It's the one subscription no one will ever cancel. And it's got that same protective shell around things like Freevee and Prime that really nobody else in TV or streaming has right now. And then lastly, the one point I would disagree with Bridget is Comcast, having worked at Comcast and launched CISO there, and their brethren in the horsemen of the streaming apocalypse, moved to streaming way too late. Way.
Completely agreed. Yeah. Well, it was part of that reliance on what you've just articulated, right?
Yeah, and they were selling.
Yeah.
Yeah, right, exactly. They thought it would last forever. Well, who's going to break this bundle? We'd have no churn. And then all of a sudden, and then they were also empowering the Huns that tore down their empire, selling their content to Hulu and Netflix.
100%.
And then they became addicted to those revenues as well. So, to a certain extent, the demise of the pay TV cord is multifaceted. It was always accelerated by some form of technology. But also, don't sleep on the fact that most of the C-suites in traditional media completely mismanaged the transformation and the evolution from, traditional TV to the streaming world that we live in now.
Doug, anything you want to add, or should we keep moving?
No, I mean, I agree with all that. The way I always think about this is through the Clayton Christensen's framework of disruptive innovation. But basically, industries get disrupted when they overserve consumers, and the old pay TV business, it was overserving consumers. It was over earning, right? They look at the margins in the cable network business. They were amongst the best margins in the economy, high 30% EBITDA margins, very low capital intensity. Used to see these stats from Nielsen that the average household was watching like 7 or 8% of the networks they got each month. And so people were just forced, you had this forced bundle jammed down everyone's throat. There was this cozy cartel between the programmers and the distributors. They used to go to the negotiations and all put their guns on the table, and they hated each other, but they still all had there was this kind of mutually beneficial arrangement where the consumer was the loser, right? The consumer was paying for too many networks that he or she didn't watch, And then again, with this disruptive model, the way that it happens is always a disruptor that comes in from the bottom, and the catalyst for them coming in the bottom is generally some sort of technological innovation. And again, what I was talking about before, the innovation was the advent of the internet, and that lowered the barriers to entry to get into the distribution business. That's what enabled Netflix to come in. And it effectively enabled people to create their own synthetic bundles. They no longer had this huge bundle jammed down their throat, and that really just sort of squeezed the excess returns out of the pay TV ecosystem, right? So when you think about
the irrational,
yeah,
greedy, overreaching
well, the
return.
unsustainable, right? Like, that's this is like this is like on the third page of your Econ 201 textbook, is that the value in an ecosystem is a function of the moats in the ecosystem. And when the moats, if a moat or multiple moats erode, then the excess returns will get squeezed out. And that's what happened. Like, when you look at half the headlines you see about the media, but why did Bob Iger come back? Why are RSNs going bankrupt? Why did the writers and the directors go on strike? Like all of it, why is Paramount for sale? All this stuff is really an industry that is struggling because there's less money to go around, right? There's less money to go around today than there used to be, and everybody is like running around with their hair on fire because of that. So yeah, I mean, when you say like, what is the effect of streaming, it really it completely upended the traditional pay TV ecosystem. And since the biggest media companies are predominantly video companies, it really it upended the whole, all of the big media companies as we know them. And just what Bridget said, certainly like the generational shift, it's hard to separate the generational shift from this transition, because these younger generations, like as Evan was saying, they weren't cord cutters because they never had the cord to begin with. So it's sort of like this virtuous circle. But the fact that we were going through a generational shift at the same time, and the advent of mobile, like that, certainly, I agree that it accelerated all that.